So August 1st, just a couple of days ago, was the 77th anniversary of the Warsaw Uprising, which is the subject of our KrakCast short history today. Before we continue, though, just a quick word of clarification. The Warsaw Uprising is often confused with another historical event for understandable reasons. I'm talking about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which was a completely separate event. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising took place in 1943, when the Jews in the Warsaw Jewish Ghetto organized armed resistance against the Nazis after they learned that the Jews who were moved out of the ghetto were not simply being relocated, as everyone was told, but instead sent to the Treblinka and Majdanek death camps for extermination. The Warsaw Uprising took place about 16 months later, starting on August 1st, 1944, as I mentioned, and lasting for 63 days until October 2nd. Like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the Warsaw Uprising also involved armed insurrection against the occupying Nazis, but was led by the Polish underground resistance, or the Polish Home Army, which technically were not the same thing, but we're going to cheat a little bit here and use them kind of interchangeably. Their stated goal was to not only liberate Warsaw from the Nazis, but to establish an independent Polish state. Now, of course, they knew that they had little chance, or maybe no chance, of achieving this through combat. But the uprising was timed to coincide with and take advantage of much larger events taking place in the war, and specifically in and around Warsaw. As early as 1943, it was clear that if Poland was to be liberated from the Nazis, it would almost certainly be by the Soviets coming from the east. And this created an extremely tricky and complicated political atmosphere for the Polish Home Army because of the icy relationship between Joseph Stalin and Poland. Now, it's impossible to fully explain everything without a short side story about the Canton forest massacre here. We don't need all the details, but it's enough to know that after the Germans discovered the bodies of the murdered Polish soldiers and accused the Soviets of the crime, Stalin severed diplomatic relations with the Polish government in exile in London in a fit of pretend indignation that anyone could believe such a horrible thing. Well, of course, Stalin was completely guilty, having signed the death warrants himself, but it was important to maintain the pretense that accusations against the Soviets were nothing more than Nazi propaganda. And if you believed that so-called propaganda, for example, if you were among the many Polish patriots who knew it to be true, but also found themselves as members of the Polish Home Army, then working with the Soviets was an extremely difficult and delicate matter. So, long story short, the Polish underground needed the Soviets. They were waiting for the Soviets. They had to work with the Soviets, but they did not trust the Soviets at all. They hated them, actually, and they were terrified that the Soviets would somehow betray them in one of hundreds of ways. So, in the summer of 1944, the Soviet Red Army, crossed into Polish territory, which triggered an important decision-making process for the Polish underground. They had a small window of opportunity to push forward with their plan, and it was now or never. The problem was that they didn't know what to expect from the Soviets. If the Polish underground started fighting the Nazis in the hope that the Soviets would soon come to their aid, it was possible that the Soviets would not get involved, leaving the underground to be crushed. If they did not start fighting the Nazis, the Soviets could frame this inaction as kind of a lack of fighting spirit, or worse, secret support for the Nazis, and the Polish underground would be delegitimized and on the next train to Siberia. So in hindsight, the Polish underground forces, they were counting on what was certainly the least likely of all possibilities, that the Soviet Red Army would not only come to their aid and help them fight the Nazis, but would then leave Warsaw under their control and continue to Berlin. Now today, we can dismiss this as the ultimate in naive wishful thinking, but hope was pretty much all they had. And they did this because it was important for the Polish resistance to have some kind of claim to legitimacy as the real authority in Warsaw, in the hope that Poland's Western allies would come to their support and defend their claim to power in conversations with the Soviets, who had their own puppet regime that they were ready to install in Poland. And taking the initiative in attacking the Nazis and making the inevitable bloody sacrifices and being the first to raise the Polish flag as the Nazis fled to the west was seen as the best, maybe the only way to achieve that goal. So the Warsaw Uprising began at 5 p.m. on August 1st, 1944. Thanks to the element of surprise, high motivation, and effective leadership, they immediately put the Nazis on their back foot, and they were able to take and secure a number of strategic positions throughout the city, and they even held bridges across the river in anticipation of the arrival of the Soviet Red Army. Leaders of the Polish Underground Army, they'd made their plans on the assumption that the Soviets would arrive within 6 or 7 days. So about a week of intense fighting, but then the tide would turn their way. But that's not how things happened. Despite already being in the eastern suburbs of the city on August 1st when the uprising started, the Red Army never made a push forward to link up with the Polish resistance in the old town on the west side of the river. Now, yes, it's true that the Soviets stopped across the river from Warsaw because they needed to let their supply lines catch up with them. They needed to regroup before pressing forward. But documents uncovered after the war made the real reason for their lack of progress clear. The Soviets deliberately halted their advance on the eastern bank of the Vistula River for cynically strategic reasons. The Kremlin ordered that no support was to be given to the Polish Home Army, and anyone found to be traveling to Warsaw to help them was to be arrested. The Soviets knew, that the people fighting the Nazis were the Polish patriots, the organizers, the fighters, the active leadership element that didn't want German or Soviet domination of their country. By stopping their advance east of the city and giving the Nazis a free hand to finish the Polish resistance, the Soviets were effectively letting the Nazis take care of a problem the Soviets didn't want either. Now, you could say that the Soviets were letting the Nazis do what the Soviets themselves had done 4 years earlier in the Canton forest: decapitate the Polish state by eliminating its political, military, social, cultural, and economic elite. Now, we're sticking to the big picture here, but those 63 days during the Warsaw Uprising were full of strategic attacks and counterattacks, changes in momentum, impressive victories for the Polish underground, and crushing defeats. But perhaps most noteworthy of the specific events within the Warsaw Uprising was the Vola Massacre, where German troops followed the orders issued by Heinrich Himmler himself and executed all Poles found behind German lines, regardless of their age or sex, and burned their bodies. Exact numbers of the dead are impossible to give, but at least 40,000 were murdered in 3 days in this one district of Warsaw. Despite the many setbacks they suffered and their increasingly desperate situation, the Polish fighters were effective enough and organized enough to finally bring the Nazis to the negotiating table. Yes, the Warsaw Uprising ended with a negotiated truce, with the Poles agreeing to lay down their arms and stop fighting on the condition that they be treated as soldiers, which gave them protections under the Geneva Convention. In the following months, the entire civilian population of Warsaw was kicked out of the city, and the members of the underground army were sent to labor camps throughout Germany and various concentration camps across Europe. The Warsaw Uprising was over, Warsaw's entire population was gone, and the city was effectively empty when the Soviet army finally arrived 3 months later in January of 1945. Warsaw, home to almost 1.5 million people in 1939, was little more than a pile of rubble 5 years later. As a result of the destruction caused by the Warsaw Uprising, together with the deliberate destruction done by the Nazis as a kind of punishment afterwards, more than half of the buildings in Warsaw were destroyed. That is, more than half of the buildings that were left in Warsaw after the battle at the beginning of the war and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of the previous year were destroyed. So by the end of 1944, about 90% of Warsaw's pre-war buildings were gone. In fact, just saying destroyed doesn't even begin to convey the extent of the violence that was inflicted on the city. If you go online, it's very easy to find pictures taken after the war, even a decade after the war, and street after street is still lined with rubble. It just seems like not a single brick was left intact. Every year on August 1st at 5 p.m., Warsaw and the entire country observes what it calls W Hour, W for the Polish word wybuch, or explosion. At 5 p.m., loud sirens mark the time when leaders of the resistance chose for the beginning of the Warsaw Uprising, and people all over the country stop what they're doing and participate in a moving commemoration of the incredible sacrifices of the heroes of this extremely important episode in the history of this country. And that is a short history of the Warsaw Uprising. Dr. Mike, you know what strikes me about the Warsaw Uprising is that it encapsulates so much of, it just contains elements of so many aspects of how Poland sees itself. The underdog, betrayed by its friends, heroism, tragedy, sacrifice, honor, ancient rivalries with neighbors to the east and west. I mean, it's all there.
Yeah, and it's not just it sees itself like that. It's like this is proof positive for them. Like every image the nation has of itself is basically right there in black and white in historical fact. I mean, there's a few things that I just want to underline that you were talking about. One of the last things you mentioned was that the city was destroyed afterwards, but these were specific instructions given by Himmler and Hitler to level the city. So they're fighting the Soviets. The Russians, they're fighting the Allies on the...
they have better things to do, you would think.
And yet the Germans decide, let's use troops and dynamite and explosives materials that we have to demolish the city block by block, building by building.
They literally set up, and this is after the Warsaw Uprising, they literally set up engineering teams to go through building by building what was left with explosives, as you say, flamethrowers, and just for petty reasons, just to destroy whatever was left, just to send a message.
The city was meant to cease to exist, to be nothing more than a train terminus for troop movements in the region. We also have to remember that a lot of people don't realize Warsaw almost did cease to exist in a manner of speaking then, because first of all, hundreds of thousands of civilians died, and some say from 100 to 200,000 civilians in a city that had already lost about 400,000 people up to this point. We're talking about the Jewish population that had been exterminated, civilian population as well, and then from the actual fighting, several 100,000 more people died, and then whoever survived was shipped off to different parts of the country. So when Warsaw started to being rebuilt after the war, a lot of those people were brought in from outside the region, from different parts of Poland. So there are very few people in Warsaw right now that can actually show their ties with Warsaw going back more than a generation.
It's almost like a reset of everything.
To a certain extent, exactly. And we also have to talk about the fact that, yes, the Horn Army, Armia Krajowa, initiated this, but a lot of people don't realize that the Horn Army, the resistance in Poland, was a branch of the Polish government in the same way that, say, the Marines or the Navy are a branch of the U.S. military. The Horn Army was, Poland never surrendered to the Germans. The government was in exile, and the forces here, the underground forces, were considered by the Polish Polish government in exile to be normal forces. Just they're soldiers here on the ground, still fighting the war. There were a lot of plans for a long time to begin some kind of insurgency. There was something called Akcja Buza, or Operation Storm, which planned to have little insurrections, diversionary actions, sabotage as the Russians were moving in. So right behind the German lines, Poles would start, blowing up bridges, attacking supply lines, everything like that.
Guerrilla tactics.
Exactly. So as the Russians moved in, the Germans could pushed out, and then the Poles would then welcome the Russians coming in. First to show, thank you for helping us liberate our own country. Unfortunately, what happened, and they sometimes were able to coordinate a lot of these actions with the Russians, but then the Russians, would come in, and NKVD would grab these officers, and they would never be heard from again. So, they would work with them until they didn't need them anymore. And this became apparent. So the higher-ups in London of the Polish government in exile realized they needed change in tactics. June, July, they start to think what to do. And one of the propositions was to concentrate all the forces instead of along the whole front, but put everything down, all the cards down, gamble everything on Warsaw. They knew they couldn't hold the city for long. They could definitely get the uprising going. The question was how many, if they last 2 days, 3 days, a week. The whole hope was that if they could liberate the city and kick out the Germans just as the Russians were coming in, then that would show to the world that, Poland had been liberated, but, it was a free country. They would even ideas of bringing in the government on exile from exile to the capital then, or to some of the recaptured territory.
But again, their presumption was that the Soviets and Stalin would say, okay, this is your country, we'll just keep going.
They knew that was a gamble, but they knew if they didn't do that, they would lose the country as well.
It was the only thing they could do. Exactly.
They could kind of do.
It was the best of a lot of bad choices.
And a lot of people don't realize that the Russians were there. You could hear the fire. They were just a few kilometers away. They even actually did get to the other side of the river right there, and a few Polish volunteers actually crossed the river. I think it was 1,600. 1,000 of them were basically shot by Germans because these were lightly armed volunteers that had no chance, and the Russians knew that. Sure, go ahead, join your friends there. It's one more less thing to worry about for them. So they were quite cynical in that point of view. And the Russians' inaction went further than that. Churchill, for instance, wanted to send in planes with supply runs and bombing. The only problem is these planes, couldn't make it there and back. So the whole idea was like they would fly in, drop what they could on Warsaw, and then land on Russian-occupied territory.
Too far behind enemy lines, and without Russian assistance.
They were coming from Egypt, I think, the British
and
plane.
the Russians said no. It's like they can't land on our territory, and they can't fly over airspace.
Well, there was a similar situation, just a quick sidebar, a similar situation after the existence and purpose of Auschwitz was definitively clarified and documented, that they wanted to do something about it, but the closest air bases were controlled by the Soviets, and Stalin said, no, not going to happen. And that's one of the reasons there was no air support or air attack on Auschwitz, is that it was just too far away.
Oh, I also have to remember the fact that as the Poles were starting their uprising in Warsaw, Russians basically stopped any kind of air attacks in the area. They stopped flying planes. So all of a sudden, the Luftwaffe in that area didn't have to worry about Russians flying over and dropping anything. So they could.
That moment? What do you think it looked like? That moment when the Nazi high command realized that the Soviets were going to let them take care of mopping up the mess in Warsaw. I mean, just imagine being a fly on the wall at that moment when they learned that this was the Soviet plan.
I mean, they could see that, but I have to remember, like, the Germans, they weren't dumb. They realized the writing on the wall, the situation wasn't going their way. But there were still a lot of people that thought, okay, we can negotiate a peace with the Allies. We just have to hold in there. We can figure this out. So they didn't realize that it was all done for. It was just a year away from complete capitulation and surrender and annihilation for the Germans. So they still thought, hold every city, fight every battle as hard as you can. So when they realized the Russians weren't going to come in there, it's like, okay, now we have to teach these Poles a lesson, get rid of this so other cities don't consider any insurrections. So although there is talk that Himmler realized at one point he thought that maybe Germany would surrender and, Hitler would be gone, but then he would be the leader of the Nazi party and the leader of the Germans. He actually thought that was a possible end route there. So we realized, if I kill all these civilians, maybe that's not such a good thing if I want to be the leader of Germany after the war. So that's why they were able to negotiate peace with the insurgents there at the end, which allowed the remaining civilians to leave the city, although a lot of them did end up in not just POW camps, but labor camps and death camps as well. So, or just let loose wild in the country with no supplies, nowhere to go in a war zone. So, that's awesome.
I mentioned the pictures that are very easy to find online of, post-war Warsaw, and just the mountains, endless piles of rubble, really.
I just think post-war Warsaw. That's
post-war Warsaw.
Tongue twister.
And there are even photos, it's amazing, of the Palace of Culture being, and this is 1955, 1956, the Palace of Culture in the later stages of its construction, almost done basically. And this is in the background, and in the foreground, again, there's just broken bricks and rubble still left over from the war and the uprising, 10, 11, maybe 12 years earlier. It took a long time to start cleaning up and rebuilding. It's odd, looking back, it is odd the priority that was apparently given to the Palace of Culture, and I think that's about the same time they started on rebuilding the Old Town as well. I think the suburbs of, a little bit further out from the war, from the Old Town had to wait the longest, but the mess was there for a long time.
I mean, they didn't have any people to fill the streets, so they didn't really need to bother as well. It's like it wasn't as if 500,000 people wanted to come back the next day and they need to rebuild everything. They could build and repopulate at the rate they wanted to for the first 10 years. It was just tragic, just horrific, like how when this one city became like the crossroads of history and politics, like all at one point, a kind of culmination.
A lot of people don't understand that prior to the war, Warsaw, Vienna, Berlin, they were very, very similar in terms of the level of, the standard of living and the lifestyle and the atmosphere. It's basically, triplets, you might say, in a sense. And, looking at post-war Warsaw, especially Cold War Warsaw, okay, it's easy to forget that. But, think of, again, Vienna being leveled. Or Berlin was kind of as level.
Yeah, maybe not the best example.
Maybe not the best example. But, just to give you an idea of what was lost, the historical markers and just the churches, the museums, the aristocratic homes and manors, the cultural legacy, everything was just... what wasn't destroyed accidentally as collateral damage in the war, as we said, was deliberately destroyed by guys walking around. They would drill a hole in a church wall and stick a dynamite in there and light it and run out. This is the level of the destruction that they purposely visited on whatever was left in the city.
Yeah, and like I said, they were using these resources to level a city while they were at war. It's like, it seems like the most illogical. It's like, okay, I can shoot my enemy or shoot this civilian.
This is after Stalingrad. Everybody knows that the big final showdown in Berlin is coming, and they're still giving priority to this. It's unbelievable.
Well, of course, I mean, it was very unfortunate that for Poland that both Hitler and Stalin personally had this, huge degree of animus against the Polish nation, the Polish people, for their own. I think Hitler just, and again, this was him personally rather than kind of Nazi ideology as such. That he just absolutely despised, Poles and Slavic people. They were, kind of like Neanderthals compared to the Aryan man or something like that. And of course, Stalin had his own reasons for hating Poles, not least because they'd given him a bloody nose back in 1920.
That's right. That was like doubly unfortunate.
And I mean, it's very easy to say with hindsight that the whole enterprise was doomed to failure. But as you said right at the beginning, I mean, it's hard to see what other options were on the table apart from just
not many
submission,
exactly.
Which would probably meant the war would have lasted a bit longer. But
you mentioned that Hitler had this special hatred for Warsaw. In particular, people often, we're here in Krakow, of course, and this is the KrakCast. Let's make it a little bit about us here. People often wonder, how Warsaw was almost physically eliminated from the map entirely, whereas Krakow suffered only some cosmetic damage. I think the Nazis dropped a couple of bombs in the Planta just to scare the local population into, kind of complying with rules. There are lots of reasons. It's kind of complex, but among the reasons is that the Germans saw Krakow as in some way like a historically German city that through historical accident had fallen into Polish hands. It was going to be one of the next great cities of the German Reich. Right? There was a Germanic element to the aristocracy here, and certain elements of German history had connections here, and it was just different. It was there.
It was sort of maybe more of a parallel to somewhere like Heidelberg, this kind of university.
Well, maybe. Yeah. But they had no intention of, knocking it to the ground. Unlike Warsaw, which, as you said, was this hive of these Untermenschen, inferior, lesser people that had to be, destroyed, and they almost did it. Dr. Mike, I wanted to ask about one other thing before we wrap it up here. Occasionally, every so often in the news here today, you see stories about survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto, or participants, I should say, in the uprising, who pass away. Of course, it's 77 years later. These people are quite old, but there's a small handful of them left, and of course, fewer and fewer every year. And it's really interesting to me that when they do pass away, these people, it's hard to find the right words, the moral authority that they have, across the political spectrum. I mean, iconic. I don't know how you want to describe it. I mean, it seems to me that in the hierarchy, there's John Paul II at the top, there's Warsaw Uprising people just below him, and then everybody else. And there, no one has a single bad word to say about them. And it's incredible to me how many of them went on to distinguished careers in academia, sometimes in politics, in science, in culture, and various things like that.
Well, some of them did. Others were repressed by the future communist regime that they could never really talk about what they did. So, it was the kind of the mentality was that when the regime here changed in the 90s, that they finally could give publicly respect to this generation that had given everything during the war, and had not only given everything but lost everything at that time. And we're talking about how old they are now, but you have to realize the only reason there are any of them left is because the average age of the people that were taken part in this uprising was very young.
Yeah.
These were Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, teenagers, 20-somethings. This was like the generation of Poles that had been born just when Poland regained independence. So, it was quite normal for a lot of them to be, 15, 16, 17 years old. This is kind of how the communist regime later kind of downplayed their influence in the future, saying the elites in London and in generals were like sending off young people to their deaths, knowing very well that, they wouldn't win, how immoral of these, capitalist, nationalistic pigs, etc. Without realizing, this was just, at that age, the righteousness and the patriotic heat is just indescribable. And so when they were held down for 5 years, it was going to explode. And the reason there are any of them still left around now is because how young they were.
No, that's an excellent point. They were barely kids.
I mean, these were kids.
Actually, I'd just like to add something. If you're in Warsaw, or if you're ever in Warsaw, I can very strongly recommend the Warsaw Uprising Museum, which is relatively, I think about 15 years ago it was set up. I've been there myself. It's what I think is an ideal example of a very, very well curated, sensitive, thoughtful, and very impactful exhibition. I mean, they've recreated like the living conditions in the cellars, which you sort of walk through. And if you can listen to John talking, you can read accounts in books, but this does a very good job of the reality of the desperation, the miserableness of the experience, and also that. Perhaps most kind of poignant, I think, that kind of, that flickering flame of hope which kept them going for so many days. And then, of course, it was extinguished. And there's that whole thing that, one of the most noteworthy episodes in Poland's history is actually, a tactical and military catastrophe.
No, you're right to mention the museum there. Of course, it's hard to find the right words, much like it's hard to find the right words to describe the museum at Auschwitz. But soon after the museum opened, which, as you say, was roughly 15 years ago, it very quickly, almost immediately, established itself as one of the musts for any visitor to Warsaw. It's just extremely well done as a museum. And good that you mentioned it. Well, that's our short history of the Warsaw Uprising. Thanks for listening, everybody. KrakCast.pl is the website, of course. Check out all of our back episodes, and we'll see you next time on the KrakCast.